A quarterback vanished in 1984, and now, 25 years later, a foreclosed storage unit reveals something that should have stayed buried. One red and white varsity jacket, vacuum-sealed like evidence, carries the stench of industrial solvent and dried blood that DNA tests confirm belonged to Derek Blaze Benton. Iron Ridge, Ohio thought their golden boy ran off to escape the pressure, but this jacket tells a different story. One of needles, booster money, and a cover-up that reaches into every corner of a town built on Friday night glory. As rookie reporter Lena Ortiz unzips that garment bag, she steps into a minefield of buried secrets, powerful enemies, and a truth that certain people killed to protect. When heroes become commodities, who pays the real price? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Iron Ridge Gazette newsroom buzzed with the familiar rhythm of deadline pressure, but Lena Ortiz felt the weight of something bigger than her usual community college sports coverage. At 22, she carried herself with the determined posture of someone who'd fought for every opportunity, her press badge still crisp enough to catch fluorescent light. The storage auction discovery 3 days ago had landed on her desk by accident, or so her editor Jonas McCall claimed when he tossed her the police blotter summary. Missing person case from '84, he'd said, not looking up from his computer. Probably nothing. But the DNA hit requires a follow-up. Keep it short. But Lena remembered Derek Benton. Not personally. She'd been barely 2 when he vanished, but through the mythology that still clung to Iron Ridge like rust on steel. His poster hung in Marcello's Pizza, faded but reverent, showing him mid-throw in that iconic red and white jacket. Her father, Miguel Ortiz, who'd worked the same steel mill as Derek's dad, still spoke of him with the hushed tones reserved for saints and martyrs. The storage facility sat on the outskirts of town, where the old industrial district met encroaching farmland. U Store It All had seen better decades, its corrugated metal buildings weathered to the color of dried blood. Lena parked her Honda Civic between puddles that reflected gray April sky and approached Unit 47, where crime scene tapes still fluttered in the wind. Detective Samantha Ruiz stood beside her unmarked cruiser, reviewing notes with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent 15 years learning that details mattered. At 43, she possessed the kind of steady presence that made witnesses trust her with their secrets. She'd grown up 3 blocks from Lena's childhood home, though their paths had never crossed until now. "You're the reporter," Ruiz said. Not quite a question. Her tone carried neither welcome nor dismissal, just acknowledgement. "Lena Ortiz, Iron Ridge Gazette. I understand you found something significant." Ruiz studied her for a moment, taking in the notebook and digital recorder, the sensible shoes and careful posture. "What do you know about Derek Benton?" "Local legend. Quarterback at Iron Ridge High, then Ohio State. Disappeared March 15th, 1984, the night before the NFL draft. Police assumed he panicked and ran. That's the official story." Ruiz unlocked the storage unit and raised the metal door. Inside, cardboard boxes and plastic tubs created a maze of abandoned possessions. "But I never bought it. Kid had everything going for him. Why run?" The unit smelled of must and neglect, but underneath lurked something chemical, harsh and medicinal. Ruiz led Lena to a cleared area where evidence markers indicated where key items had been found. The vacuum-sealed garment bag had contained not just the jacket, but other items that painted a troubling picture. Carl Jennings rented this unit in 1991, Ruiz explained, consulting her notes. Paid cash monthly for 18 years. Started missing payments last fall when his medical bills got out of hand. Cancer treatment ate up his savings, Lena wrote quickly, her journalism training kicking in. Why would an equipment manager keep Derek's jacket? That's what we're trying to figure out. CJ's in hospice now, but he's been asking to speak with someone about '84. Claims he has information that could set things right. They drove to Sunset Manor in separate cars, Lena following Ruiz through streets that told Iron Ridge's story in architectural layers. Victorian houses from the steel boom years stood beside modest ranch homes from the post-war expansion, while newer subdivisions sprawled at the town's edges, built for commuters who worked elsewhere but still wanted small-town life for their children. Carl Jennings looked older than his 67 years, cancer having hollowed his cheeks and dimmed his eyes. But when he saw Ruiz and Lena enter his room, something sparked, relief mixed with long-carried burden. "I've been waiting," he said, his voice paper-thin but determined. 25 years of waiting. Lena set up her recorder with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Jennings, I'm Lena Ortiz from the Gazette. Detective Ruiz says you have information about Derek Benton." CJ's hands trembled as he reached for the water cup beside his bed. That boy didn't run away. Derek Benton died in the locker room, March 15th, 1984. Around 11:30 at night, I helped move his body. The admission hung in the antiseptic air like smoke. Lena felt her pulse quicken, but kept her expression neutral. Good reporters didn't react. They listened. "Who else was involved?" Ruiz asked. "Coach Taggart, Dr. Morrison from the University Medical Center, Randall Pierce." CJ's voice strengthened with each name, as if speaking them aloud lifted some weight. Pierce called the shots, said it would destroy everything. The program, the town, the university. Too much money at stake. Lena's mind raced. Pierce Construction had built half of Iron Ridge's commercial district. Randall Pierce still owned the largest car dealership in 3 counties, sponsored the high school team, sat on the hospital board. "What really happened that night?" she asked. CJ closed his eyes, gathering strength or courage. Derek had been getting injections, some kind of experimental stuff, supposed to boost recovery time and focus. Dr. Morrison was running trials. Pierce was funding it. They told the boys it was vitamins and minerals. But it wasn't, Ruiz said. It's 19, they called it. Morrison claimed it was revolutionary, would give college athletes the edge they needed for professional sports. But it had side effects, made the boys irritable, gave them headaches. Derek had been complaining about seizures. Lena felt pieces clicking together. He had a seizure that night, came to get his playbook, found him on the locker room floor, convulsing something terrible, hit his head on the bench when he went down. By the time we got him to the medical center, he was gone. The story emerged in fragments, punctuated by CJ's labored breathing and the distant sounds of the nursing home. Pierce had arrived within an hour, bringing lawyers and a cleanup crew. They'd crafted the runaway narrative, claiming Derek had left his jacket behind because he was ashamed of failing drug tests that never happened. "Why keep the jacket?" Lena asked. CJ managed a bitter smile. "Insurance. Figured if they tried to silence me, I'd have proof." But years went by, and everyone seemed to forget. Then I got sick. Couldn't afford the storage unit anymore. Detective Ruiz leaned forward. "Where did you move the body?" "Maintenance tunnel under the old stadium. Pierce had it sealed up during renovations in '85. Said it was for structural integrity." Lena's recorder captured every word, but she knew this was just the beginning. A 25-year-old murder with wealthy, powerful perpetrators wouldn't unravel easily. And in a town like Iron Ridge, where high school football provided the last thread connecting residents to better times, challenging heroes carried its own risks. As they prepared to leave, CJ grabbed Lena's wrist with surprising strength. That boy had dreams beyond football, wanted to be a teacher, maybe coach someday. But they turned him into a commodity, and when the commodity broke, they threw it away. Outside Sunset Manor, Detective Ruiz handed Lena her business card. "This is a police matter now, but I know how these things work in small towns. You'll probably learn things I can't." Lena nodded, understanding the unspoken alliance. "What's your next step?" "Exhume the tunnel. See if CJ's telling the truth." Ruiz paused at her car door. "Be careful. If Pierce killed once to protect this secret, he might do it again." Driving back toward town, Lena noticed things she'd never paid attention to before. Pierce Construction signs on half the buildings, Pierce Motors sponsorship banners at the high school, Pierce family names on hospital wings and library editions. The Pierces hadn't just survived Iron Ridge's decline, they'd positioned themselves to profit from it. Her phone buzzed with a text from her editor. "How's the storage unit story coming? Need 500 words by 6. 500 words wouldn't scratch the surface of what she'd uncovered. But Lena Ortiz, first-generation college graduate and daughter of a steelworker, had learned that the biggest stories often started with the smallest lies. She just needed to be careful not to become another casualty of Iron Ridge's buried secrets. The sun was setting behind the old steel mill as she drove past the high school stadium, where lights illuminated an empty field that had witnessed more glory than tragedy. But somewhere beneath that field lay the truth about Derek Benton, and the proof that heroes weren't always what they seemed. That evening, Lena sat in her cramped apartment above Kowalski's bakery, laptop open on her kitchen table, trying to process everything she'd learned. The smell of tomorrow's bread dough rose through the floorboards, a comforting constant in a day that had upended everything she thought she knew about her hometown's most famous mystery. She'd grown up hearing stories about Derek Benton from her father, who'd worked alongside Derek's father Frank at the steel mill. Miguel Ortiz had immigrated from Guatemala in 1978, drawn by promises of steady work and the American dream. The mill provided both, at least until the plant closures of the early 90s. But in 1984, when Derek disappeared, the Ortiz and Benton families had been neighbors, sharing the same hopes for their children's futures. That boy was different, her father had told her countless times. Not just the arm, though God knows he could throw. Had a head on his shoulders, respectful, always asked about my English classes at the community center. Now, transcribing CJ's testimony, Lena wondered how much her father really knew. The immigrant community in Iron Ridge had always existed somewhat apart from the football mythology that defined the town's identity. They worked the same jobs, sent their kids to the same schools, but the hero worship surrounding high school athletics felt like something they observed rather than participated in. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Trevor Benton's name appeared on the screen. "Miss Ortiz? This is Trevor Benton, Derek's brother. Detective Ruiz gave me your number. She said you might want to talk." Lena grabbed her recorder and notebook. "Mr. Benton, yes. I'm working on a story about your brother's case. Would you be willing to meet tomorrow morning? There are things I need to show you, things I've been saving for 25 years." They arranged to meet at the Benton family home on Maple Street, a modest two-story that had seen better decades. Lena spent the rest of the evening researching everything she could find about the 1984 disappearance, scrolling through archived newspaper articles and police reports that painted the official picture of a young man overwhelmed by pressure. The contemporary coverage had been surprisingly sparse. A few articles in the first week, then scattered follow-ups that gradually faded as other stories took precedence. The narrative never varied. Derek Benton, facing the pressure of professional football, had simply walked away from his life. But reading between the lines, Lena noticed inconsistencies. Teammates described him as excited about the draft, not anxious. His girlfriend at the time, now married and living in California, had told police he'd been making plans for after football, talking about coaching, maybe pursuing a teaching degree. These weren't the words of someone planning to disappear. The next morning brought April sunshine that made Iron Ridge look almost hopeful. Dogwoods bloomed along residential streets, and the town's older residents were already working in their gardens, preparing for another growing season. It was the kind of morning that made it hard to believe in conspiracies and cover-ups. Trevor Benton answered his door before Lena could knock. At 52, he carried himself with the careful posture of someone who'd spent decades managing other people's expectations about his famous brother. His resemblance to the photos of Derek was striking. The same strong jaw, the same intelligent eyes. But where Derek had radiated confidence, Trevor seemed weighted down by years of unanswered questions. "Come in," he said, leading her into a living room that felt frozen in time. Family photos covered every surface, most featuring Derek in various football uniforms, but it was the gaps that told the real story. No pictures of Derrick after high school graduation. No college memorabilia. No professional prospects memorialized. My parents never stopped believing he'd come home, Trevor said, noticing her attention to the photos. Dad died in 2003. Mom, 2 years later, both of them convinced he was out there somewhere, maybe with amnesia or too ashamed to contact us. He led her to the basement, where he'd maintained what looked like a private investigation center. Cork boards covered the walls, connected by red string that traced relationships and timelines. Newspaper clippings, photocopied police reports, and handwritten notes created a comprehensive map of the official investigation and its failures. I was 17 when Derrick disappeared, Trevor said. Everyone expected me to grieve and move on. But I knew my brother. He wouldn't just leave without saying goodbye. The basement revealed the depth of Trevor's obsession. He'd tracked down every person who'd had contact with Derrick in his final weeks, conducted his own interviews, even hired a private investigator in the mid-90s when the family could afford it. "What did you find?" Lena asked. Trevor pulled out a thick folder. Inconsistencies. The official timeline never made sense. Police said Derrick left his dorm room around 9 p.m. on March 15th, but his roommate swears he was there until at least 10:30. Security footage from the athletic center shows someone entering the building at 11:15, but the timestamp was mysteriously corrupted. He showed her copies of medical records he'd obtained through persistent FOIA requests. Derrick had been seeing the team doctor more frequently in his final semester. Complaints about headaches, trouble sleeping, mood swings. But when I tried to interview Dr. Morrison, he claimed doctor-patient privilege and refused to discuss it. Lena studied the timeline Trevor had constructed. "You suspected something was wrong even before CJ's confession?" I knew there was a cover-up. Too many people gave conflicting stories. Then suddenly everyone started saying the same thing, that Derrick was under pressure and ran away, like they'd all been coached. Trevor's research had identified the same players CJ had named: Coach Taggart, Dr. Morrison, and Randall Pierce. But he'd also uncovered financial connections between Pierce's various businesses and the university athletic department that went far beyond normal sponsorship deals. Pierce wasn't just funding football, Trevor said. He had contracts for all the major construction projects on campus: new dormitories, the medical center expansion, even the stadium renovations in '85. Millions of dollars in university contracts. The picture that emerged was of a man with enormous financial incentives to keep the football program clean and successful. A drug scandal involving the star quarterback wouldn't just damage the team. It could cost Pierce Construction millions in lost contracts. "Have you shared this with Detective Ruiz?" Lena asked. "Some of it. But she has to follow official procedures, build a case that will hold up in court. I just need to know what happened to my brother." As Lena prepared to leave, Trevor handed her a manila envelope. "There's one more thing. I never told the police about this because I wasn't sure what it meant." Inside was a letter, handwritten on university stationery, dated March 10th, 1984, 5 days before Derrick's disappearance. "Can't keep doing this. The stuff they're giving us isn't vitamins. Jimmy Chen had another seizure yesterday, and Coach is pretending it's dehydration. I'm going to talk to someone after the draft, maybe a reporter or the NCAA. This has to stop before someone gets seriously hurt. Don't worry about me. But if something happens, look for the truth, where they think no one will find it. D." Lena read the letter twice, her hands trembling slightly. Jimmy Chen. Was he another player? Linebacker. Died in a car accident 6 months after Derrick disappeared. Single car crash on a straight stretch of a road. Police said he fell asleep at the wheel. The implications hung heavy between them. If Derrick had been planning to expose the drug trials, his disappearance took on an entirely different meaning. This wasn't a panicked young man running from pressure. This was someone who'd been silenced before he could reveal a conspiracy. "Why are you trusting me with this?" Lena asked. Trevor's smile was sad, but determined. "Because you're not from here. Not really. Your family came later, after the football glory days. You don't have 25 years of invested belief in the official story. And because Detective Ruiz trusts you." Walking back to her car, Lena felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. This was no longer just a story about a missing quarterback. It was about institutional corruption, the commodification of young athletes, and a cover-up that had lasted a quarter century. Her phone buzzed with another text from her editor. Need that storage unit story by noon. 500 words max. 500 words wouldn't even scratch the surface of what she'd uncovered. But Lena Ortiz had learned something important about journalism. Sometimes, the biggest stories started with the smallest lies. And sometimes the truth required more courage than a young reporter was supposed to need. Lena's story about the storage unit discovery ran on page 3 of the Iron Ridge Gazette the next morning, buried beneath city council minutes and high school sports scores. Jonas McCall had edited her 200-word investigation down to exactly 500 words, removing every reference to drug trials, cover-ups, or the inconsistencies in the original investigation. Benton case reopened, read the sanitized headline, followed by a bland summary that mentioned DNA evidence and renewed police interest without providing any context about what the evidence actually revealed. Lena stared at the newspaper over her morning coffee, feeling her first real taste of institutional resistance. She'd been naive to think her editor would run the full story without pushback, but seeing her careful reporting reduced to meaningless filler still stung. Her phone rang at 7:30 a.m. Detective Ruiz's voice carried an urgency that made Lena grab her notebook before she'd even said hello. "We found something at the stadium," Ruiz said. "Can you meet me there in 20 minutes? And bring your recorder." The Iron Ridge High School stadium sat adjacent to the old university campus, its concrete structure showing 40 years of weather and deferred maintenance. Construction equipment surrounded the south end zone, where crews had been installing new drainage systems. Yellow crime scene tape now cordoned off a section near the maintenance building. Detective Ruiz met Lena at the gate, her expression grim. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed CJ's story. There's definitely something down there. They walked toward the construction site, where a small excavator had exposed the entrance to what had once been a maintenance tunnel. The opening, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through, had been sealed with concrete blocks that were now broken and scattered around the site. "The construction foreman called us yesterday evening," Ruiz explained. "They were digging the drainage trench when they hit the tunnel. Found these concrete blocks that didn't match any architectural plans for the stadium. Crime scene technicians worked methodically around the tunnel entrance, photographing everything before disturbing the scene. The smell that emerged from the opening was musty and chemical, with an underlying sweetness that made Lena's stomach turn. "Have you been inside yet?" she asked. "Waiting for the coroner and state crime lab, but we did find this." Ruiz held up an evidence bag containing what looked like torn pages from a playbook. These were just inside the entrance, like someone dropped them while crawling in. Even through the plastic evidence bag, Lena could see handwritten notes in the margins of the playbook pages. Numbers, initials, what looked like dosage schedules. Her pulse quickened as she recognized the implications. "That's the smoking gun," she said. "Proof that the drug trials were real, maybe. We'll need handwriting analysis to confirm these are Derek's notes. But it's looking more and more like CJ was telling the truth." A commotion near the parking lot drew their attention. Randall Pierce stepped out of a black Mercedes, flanked by 2 men in expensive suits who had lawyer written all over them. Even at 68, Pierce commanded attention. Tall, silver-haired, wearing a perfectly tailored coat that probably cost more than Lena made in a month. "Detective Ruiz," Pierce called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I understand you're conducting an investigation on school property." Ruiz's posture stiffened, but her voice remained professional. "Mr. Pierce, this is an active crime scene. I'll need you to stay behind the tape, of course. I'm simply concerned about the disruption to our construction schedule. Pierce Construction has a contract to complete this drainage system before the start of football season." The audacity was breathtaking. Here was a man, potentially implicated in a 25-year-old murder, worried about construction deadlines. But Lena noticed something else in Pierce's demeanor, a controlled tension that suggested he wasn't as calm as he appeared. The investigation will take as long as necessary, Ruiz replied. School district has been notified. Pierce's eyes found Lena, and she felt the weight of his attention like a physical presence. Miss Ortiz, isn't it? I read your article this morning. Interesting work. There was nothing overtly threatening in his words, but something in his tone made Lena's skin crawl. This was a man who'd spent decades wielding influence in Iron Ridge, and he wasn't used to being challenged. I'm just reporting the facts, Mr. Pierce. Facts can be interpreted many different ways, he said smoothly. I hope you'll be careful to get the whole story before drawing conclusions. Iron Ridge has enough problems without dredging up old rumors. One of Pierce's lawyers stepped forward. Detective, my client wants to cooperate fully with your investigation. However, we're concerned about the impact on ongoing construction projects. Perhaps there's a way to expedite the process? Ruiz's laugh held no humor. This is a potential homicide investigation, counselor. It'll take as long as it takes. The standoff lasted another few minutes before Pierce and his legal team retreated to their car. But as they drove away, Lena noticed Pierce making a phone call, his expression dark with anger. He's not going to make this easy, she observed. No, Ruiz agreed. But we've got the law on our side, and now we've got evidence. The crime scene team worked for another 3 hours before the coroner arrived to examine the tunnel. Dr. Sarah Martinez had been Stark County's chief medical examiner for 15 years, and her reputation for thoroughness was legendary. She disappeared into the tunnel wearing full protective gear, emerging 40 minutes later with several evidence bags and a grave expression. Definitely human remains, she confirmed. Male, approximately 22 years old based on preliminary examination. Significant trauma to the skull, consistent with blunt force impact. Lena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the April wind. After 25 years, Derek Benton had finally been found. How long for identification? Ruiz asked. Dental records, if they still exist. DNA comparison with family members. Could be a week, maybe 2. But Lena already knew what the tests would confirm. The location matched CJ's confession, the timeline fit, and the playbook pages provided the missing link between Derek's death and the drug trials that had killed him. As the crime scene team packed up their equipment, Lena's phone buzzed with a call from Jonas McCall. Lena, I need you back at the office, now! Something in her editor's tone made her stomach clench. What's wrong? Just get here, we need to talk. The drive back to the Gazette offices felt like a funeral procession. Lena had been a journalist long enough to recognize the sound of a story being killed, and she suspected that Pierce's phone call hadn't been to his construction crew. The newsroom was unusually quiet when she arrived. Several colleagues looked up from their computers with expressions of sympathy that confirmed her worst fears. Jonas McCall waited in his office, the door already closed. Sit down, he said without preamble. We have a problem. Lena remained standing. Let me guess. Randall Pierce called. The publisher called. Pierce is threatening to pull all advertising from Pierce Construction, Pierce Motors, and Pierce Real Estate. That's about 40% of our revenue, so we're killing the story. McCall looked older than his 55 years, the weight of small-town journalism etched in every line of his face. We're putting it on hold until the police investigation is complete. Jonas, this is the biggest story to hit Iron Ridge in decades. We can't just... We can, and we will. His voice carried a finality that brooked no argument. Lena, I've been running newspapers for 30 years. I know the difference between journalism and suicide. Lena felt something crystallize inside her, a decision that had been building since she'd first seen Derek's jacket. Then I quit. McCall's expression softened. Don't be hasty. You're a good reporter, but you're young. You don't understand how these things work in a town like this. I understand perfectly, Lena said, already mentally composing her resignation letter. That's exactly why I'm leaving. She walked out of the Iron Ridge Gazette for the last time, carrying nothing but her notebook and the knowledge that some stories were bigger than the newspapers that refused to print them. Lena's unemployment lasted exactly 18 hours. She'd spent the evening updating her resume and researching journalism jobs in Columbus and Cleveland when her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. Miss Ortiz? This is Rebecca Chen. I think we need to talk." The name triggered recognition. Jimmy Chen, the linebacker mentioned in Derek's letter to Trevor, had been Rebecca's younger brother. They met the next morning at a diner in neighboring Millfield, far enough from Iron Ridge to avoid unwanted attention. Rebecca Chen looked like she'd spent 25 years carrying the weight of unanswered questions. At 48, she worked as a nurse practitioner in Columbus, but her connection to Iron Ridge remained strong enough to bring her back when Detective Ruiz had contacted her about reopening Jimmy's case. "They told us it was an accident," she said, stirring sugar into her coffee with mechanical precision. "Single car crash, no other vehicles involved. Jimmy fell asleep at the wheel, they said. But my brother didn't fall asleep driving. He was afraid of driving tired after our cousin died in a similar accident." Lena set her recorder on the table between them. "Tell me about the months before he died." Changed completely after football season ended. Jimmy had always been quiet, but this was different. Paranoid, jumpy, having trouble sleeping. My parents thought it was depression, maybe delayed reaction to not getting drafted. But now I wonder if it was something else. Rebecca pulled out a manila folder, much like the one Trevor Benton had shown Lena. "I never stopped investigating. When Detective Ruiz called about Derek's case, I knew the two were connected." The folder contained medical records, accident reports, and Rebecca's own research into the circumstances surrounding Jimmy's death. What emerged was a pattern disturbingly similar to Derek's final weeks. Medical visits for headaches and mood changes. Complaints about experimental treatments that coaches claimed were routine supplements. "Jimmy mentioned injections," Rebecca said, "called them performance boosters that all the scholarship players were getting. But he said they made him feel weird, aggressive sometimes, foggy other times." Lena studied the timeline Rebecca had constructed. Jimmy Chen died September 8, 1984, exactly 6 months after Derek's disappearance. The accident occurred on Route 33, a straight stretch of highway Jimmy had driven hundreds of times. "The police report mentions no skid marks," Rebecca continued, "like he didn't even try to brake or steer. They attributed it to falling asleep. But what if it was a seizure? What if he had the same reaction Derek did?" The implications were staggering. If the experimental drug trials had killed 2 players, the cover-up involved not just murder, but a systematic poisoning of young athletes. Lena felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with uncovering a major story. "Have you shared this with Detective Ruiz?" "Yesterday. She's reopening Jimmy's case as potentially connected to Derek's murder." Rebecca's voice hardened. 25 years of being told I was imagining things, that I couldn't accept my brother's death was an accident. Now they want to take me seriously. After Rebecca left, Lena sat in the diner booth, staring at her notes and trying to process the scope of what she'd uncovered. 2 dead players, experimental drug trials, a cover-up involving university officials and wealthy boosters. This wasn't just a local crime story. It was a cautionary tale about the commodification of college athletics that had national implications. Her phone buzzed with a text from Trevor Benton. "Can you meet me at the house? Found something else." Trevor was waiting in his basement office when Lena arrived, his expression a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He'd been going through boxes of his brother's belongings that had been stored in the attic for decades. "Found this in Derek's old textbooks," he said, holding up a small ledger bound in black leather, hidden inside a hollowed-out economics book. The ledger was perhaps the most damning piece of evidence yet. Written in Derek's careful handwriting, it documented cash payments from booster organizations to players, coaches, and medical staff. But these weren't the typical under-the-table payments that occasionally scandalized college sports. These were systematic bribes connected to the drug trials. "Look at the dates," Trevor said, pointing to entries from late 1983 and early 1984. Payments to Dr. Morrison, Coach Taggart, even some of the trainers. And here, he flipped to a page near the back, payments to players who agreed to participate in enhanced training protocols. Lena photographed every page with her phone, documenting the financial network that had funded the deadly experiments. Randall Pierce's name appeared throughout the ledger. sometimes as direct payments, other times funneled through his various business entities. "This proves it was systematic," she said. "Not just one rogue doctor, but an organized conspiracy involving boosters, coaches, and university officials. There's more." Trevor handed her a letter tucked between the ledger's pages. This was with it. The letter was addressed to Derek from someone identified only as M, presumably Dr. Morrison. It was dated March 12, 1984, 3 days before Derek's death. "Do you understand your concerns about side effects? Adjusting dosage protocols should eliminate seizure risk. Critical that we maintain program security until trials complete. Your cooperation ensures everyone's success. Payment structure remains as discussed." Lena read the letter twice, feeling sick. They knew the drugs were causing seizures, but they kept the trials going. "Gets worse," Trevor said grimly. "Look at the final entries." The last page of the ledger contained what appeared to be a list of names with check marks beside them. Derek Benton, Jimmy Chen, and 3 other names Lena didn't recognize. At the bottom, in different handwriting that looked hurried and angry, someone had written, "They're killing us for money." "That's not Derek's handwriting," Trevor observed. "Maybe Jimmy's? Or one of the other players?" Lena was photographing the final page when her phone rang. Detective Ruiz's voice was tense. "Lena, where are you?" "At Trevor's house. Why?" "Someone broke into CJ Jennings' room at the nursing home last night. Tore the place apart, looking for something. CJ's okay, but he's scared. Says he wants to tell us everything he knows before they come back." The break-in changed everything. What had been a cold case investigation was now an active threat. Someone, presumably connected to the original cover-up, was desperate enough to intimidate a dying man in a nursing home. "We'll meet you at Sunset Manor," Lena said. They found CJ Jennings sitting up in bed, looking frailer than he had just days earlier. The stress of the break-in had clearly taken a toll, but his eyes held a determination that hadn't been there before. "They came around 3 a.m., he told Detective Ruiz. 2 men, dressed like orderlies, but I'd never seen them before. Went through everything, dumped out drawers, even checked inside my medication bottles." "What were they looking for?" Ruiz asked. CJ's smile was grim. "This." He reached under his mattress and pulled out a small metal box, the kind used for important documents. "Insurance policy I never told anyone about." Inside the box were vials, small glass containers with medical labels that read PX19 and dosage instructions. Several were empty, but 3 still contained a clear liquid that caught the fluorescent light. "Kept these from the night Derek died," CJ explained. "Figured they might be important someday. Dr. Morrison was so focused on cleaning up the mess, he never did a proper inventory of the drugs." Detective Ruiz handled the vials with evidence gloves, her expression grave. "These are going straight to the state crime lab. If we can prove what's in them, we might finally have the smoking gun." But CJ wasn't finished. From the bottom of the box, he pulled out a folded piece of paper that looked like it had been torn from a medical chart. "This too," he said. "Morrison's notes from that night. Shows Derek wasn't the only one having problems." The medical notes, written in Dr. Morrison's precise handwriting, documented adverse reactions in multiple trial participants: seizures, severe headaches, aggressive behavior, memory loss. The notes indicated that Morrison had recommended discontinuing the trials, but that recommendation had been overruled by administrative directive. "Administrative directive meaning the boosters," Lena said. "Pierce specifically," CJ confirmed. "Morrison showed me this the night Derek died. Said Pierce threatened to cut funding for the entire medical program if the trials stopped. Too much money invested. Too many future contracts at stake." The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear. This wasn't just about performance enhancement or competitive advantage. It was about money. Pierce Construction's contracts with the university were worth millions, and the football program's success was directly tied to those contracts. A drug scandal would have destroyed everything. "Why didn't Dr. Morrison speak up?" Ruiz asked. CJ's laugh was bitter. "Same reason I didn't for 25 years. Fear. Pierce made it clear what would happen to anyone who talked. Morrison had a family, a career, a reputation to protect. Easier to go along with the cover-up than risk everything. As they prepared to leave Sunset Manor, CJ grabbed Lena's hand with surprising strength. "That boy in your article yesterday, you got his name wrong." "What do you mean?" "Derek Benton wasn't his real name. Birth certificate says Derek Benton. No Sia. Small thing, but reporters are supposed to get details right." Lena felt a chill run down her spine. She'd been so careful with her research, cross-referencing multiple sources. How had she missed something so basic? "Where did you get the name with the CPO?" she asked. "University records, newspaper clippings, even his headstone. All spelled it wrong. Only person who ever got it right was his brother Trevor." Outside in the parking lot, Detective Ruiz voiced what they were all thinking. If they changed his name in official records, what else did they change? The answer came 2 hours later, when Lena and Trevor met with the Iron Ridge High School registrar. Armed with Trevor's authorization as next of kin, they requested Derek Benton's original academic records. What they found was stunning. Derek Benton's high school transcripts showed a solid B student with above-average SAT scores, good enough for college admission, but not exceptional. The transcripts that had accompanied his university application, however, showed straight A's and test scores that would have qualified him for academic scholarships. They didn't just cover up his death, Lena realized. They manufactured his entire academic profile to justify the recruitment package. Trevor stared at the conflicting documents, his face pale. "My brother was smart, but he wasn't a genius. He got into Ohio State because of his arm, not his grades." The implications were staggering. If Derek's academic records had been falsified, how many other aspects of the official story were lies? And if Pierce and his conspirators were willing to break into a nursing home 25 years later, what would they do to protect secrets that could still destroy them? Lena's phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. When she answered, the voice was electronically distorted, but unmistakably threatening. "Stop digging, Miss Ortiz. Some stories are better left buried." The line went dead, leaving Lena staring at her phone while Trevor and Detective Ruiz watched with growing alarm. "We're getting close," Ruiz said grimly, "and they're getting desperate." The threatening phone call marked a turning point in the investigation. What had begun as a cold case review was now an active threat to people's lives. Detective Ruiz insisted on police protection for both Lena and Trevor, but small-town resources meant surveillance rather than around-the-clock security. Lena moved temporarily into her parents' house on the east side of town, where her father Miguel's presence provided both comfort and additional eyes. At 63, he retained the watchful instincts of someone who'd navigated decades as an immigrant in a predominantly white community. "Mija," he said over breakfast the morning after the phone threat, "maybe it's time to let the police handle this." "I can't stop now, Papa. We're too close to the truth." Miguel stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "I worked with Frank Benton for 15 years. Good man, proud of his boy. But there were things." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Things that didn't make sense about Derek's disappearance." Lena set down her toast, attention focused. "What kind of things?" Frank got a visit from university officials about a week after Derek vanished. Came to work the next day looking like he'd aged 10 years. Stopped talking about bringing Derek home. Stopped pushing the police for updates. Just accepted that his son was gone. "What did they tell him?" Miguel shrugged. Frank never said. But word around the plant was that someone convinced him Derek had gotten mixed up in something bad. Drugs, maybe gambling debts. Better to let sleeping dogs lie. This revelation added another layer to the conspiracy. The cover-up hadn't just involved official channels. It had required silencing Derek's own family. Lena wondered what threats or incentives had been used to buy Frank Benton's silence. Her phone buzzed with a text from Detective Ruiz. "Lab results back on the vials. Meet me at the station." The Iron Ridge Police Department occupied a converted Victorian mansion that had seen better days. Detective Ruiz met Lena in the lobby, her expression grim but determined. "State Crime Lab confirmed what we suspected," she said, leading Lena to a small conference room. X-19 is a synthetic stimulant compound. chemically similar to amphetamines, but with additional neurotropic properties. Highly experimental, never approved for human trials. Ruiz spread out laboratory reports and chemical analysis documents. According to the lab, this stuff was designed to enhance focus and reaction time while reducing the perception of fatigue. Perfect for athletes if it worked. Problem is, it's also highly neurotoxic in anything above minimal doses. Meaning it literally damages brain tissue. Seizures, paranoia, aggressive behavior, eventually death. The dosage levels documented in Morrison's notes would have been fatal for most people within months of regular use. Lena studied the chemical breakdown, trying to understand the technical language. How did they get approval for human trials? They didn't, Ruiz said bluntly. This was completely unauthorized experimentation. The university had no oversight, no safety protocols, no informed consent from the subjects. What Morrison and Pierce were doing was criminally negligent at best, murder at worst. The conference room door opened, and a woman Lena didn't recognize entered. Dr. Evelyn Chung appeared to be in her 50s, with graying hair and the intense focus of someone accustomed to working with complex data. Dr. Chung is a pharmacologist at Ohio State, Ruiz explained. She's been reviewing the evidence at my request. Dr. Chung spread additional documents on the table. I've been researching PX-19 since Detective Ruiz contacted me. Fascinating compound, actually, though completely unsuitable for human use. The research trail goes back to 1982, when a pharmaceutical company called Apex Biotechnology was developing performance enhancers for military applications. Military? Lena asked. Combat effectiveness drugs. The idea was to create soldiers who could function at peak performance for extended periods without rest. But animal trials showed severe neurological damage, and the project was scrapped in early 1983. Dr. Chung pulled out a photograph of laboratory equipment. Here's where it gets interesting. Apex Biotechnology was a subsidiary of Pierce Pharmaceuticals, which was owned by Randall Pierce. Lena finished. Exactly. When the military contract was canceled, Pierce apparently decided to repurpose the research for athletic applications. Much smaller test population, less oversight, potential for huge profits if they could prove effectiveness. The picture was becoming clearer. Pierce hadn't just funded the drug trials. He had designed them as a way to monetize failed military research. College athletes became unwitting test subjects for compounds that had already been deemed too dangerous for soldiers. How many players were involved? Ruiz asked. Dr. Chung consulted her notes. Based on the dosage schedules in Derek's ledger, at least 12 players over 2 seasons. Maybe more in other programs. There's evidence Pierce was shopping this technology to multiple universities. Lena felt sick, thinking about young men like Derek and Jimmy, excited about their athletic futures, unknowingly participating in experiments that would kill them. Where are the other players now? That's what we need to find out, Ruiz said. Some may still be alive, experiencing long-term neurological effects. Others, she didn't finish the sentence. They spent the next hour reviewing the list of names from Derek's ledger, cross-referencing them with university records, and trying to track down current addresses. Of the 12 players identified, 3 were confirmed dead. Derek, Jimmy Chen, and a linebacker named Marcus Williams, who had died of a brain aneurysm in 1987. 3 dead out of 12 participants, Dr. Chung observed. That's a 25% fatality rate. In legitimate medical trials, those numbers would shut down the entire program immediately. But this wasn't a legitimate trial, Lena pointed out. This was an illegal experiment disguised as performance enhancement. As they prepared to contact the surviving players, Lena's phone rang. The caller ID showed a local number she didn't recognize. Miss Ortiz, this is Coach Raymond Taggart. We need to talk. Lena's pulse quickened. After 25 years of silence, the man at the center of the conspiracy was ready to speak. They met at Taggart's house in the hills outside Iron Ridge, a modest ranch that spoke to middle-class retirement rather than the wealth one might expect from someone involved in a major cover-up. At 71, Taggart moved with the careful gait of someone whose knees had absorbed decades of sideline pacing. "Detective Ruiz says you found Derek's body," he said without preamble, leading them into a living room lined with football memorabilia. "I've been waiting 25 years for this conversation." Lena set up her recorder while studying Taggart's face. She'd expected defiance or denial, but what she saw was exhaustion, mixed with something that might have been relief. "Tell us what happened," Ruiz said. Taggart poured himself a whiskey despite the early hour. "You have to understand the pressure we were under. Iron Ridge had never had a player make it to the NFL. Derek was going to change that, put our program on the map, bring in recruiting advantages, maybe even television coverage. So you agreed to the drug trials." Pierce made it sound legitimate, called it cutting-edge sports medicine, said universities across the country were implementing similar programs, showed me research data, testimonials from other coaches. I thought we were giving our boys every advantage. Taggart's story emerged in fragments, interrupted by long pauses and careful sips of whiskey. The trials had begun in fall 1983 with 6 players, including Derek and Jimmy. Initial results seemed promising. Improved focus, faster recovery from workouts, better performance in high-pressure situations. "When did you realize something was wrong?" Lena asked. "December, maybe January. Jimmy started having mood swings, aggressive episodes during practice. Derek complained about headaches, said he was having trouble sleeping. I talked to Morrison about reducing the dosages, but Pierce overruled me." "Pierce overruled you?" Taggart's laugh was bitter. "You think I was running that program? Pierce was paying for everything. The medical staff, the equipment, even my salary supplements. He owned us all." The admission hung in the air like smoke. Taggart described a systematic corruption that went far beyond simple recruitment violations. Pierce had essentially purchased the entire football program, turning coaches and medical staff into employees of his pharmaceutical experiments. "What happened the night Derek died?" Taggart closed his eyes, gathering strength for the hardest part of his story. "Derek came to see me around 10:30, said he couldn't take the injections anymore. Showed me a letter he'd written to the NCAA, documenting everything. Said he was going to mail it after the draft. You tried to stop him." "I begged him to reconsider, explained what it would mean for the program, for the other players, for the community. But Derek was determined, said some things were more important than football." Taggart described following Derek to the locker room, where they'd continued arguing. Derek had started packing his equipment, saying he was transferring to another school rather than participate in the trials any longer. That's when the seizure started. One moment he was talking, the next he was on the floor, convulsing, hit his head on the bench corner when he fell. "You called for help?" "Called Morrison, then Pierce. They were there within 20 minutes with a cleanup crew. Morrison pronounced Derek dead, said the seizure had caused massive brain trauma. The cover-up had been swift and efficient. Pierce's people had removed Derek's body, while Taggart and Morrison crafted the runaway story. They'd planted Derek's car at a bus station in Columbus, distributed false sightings, even hired actors to call in tips about someone matching Derek's description in other states. "Why participate in the cover-up?" Ruiz asked. "Why not just report the death as accidental?" Taggart refilled his whiskey glass with shaking hands. Pierce made it clear what would happen if the truth came out. The drug trials, the payments to players and coaches, the falsified academic records, it would have destroyed everyone involved. University would have faced federal investigation, loss of accreditation, millions in lawsuits, and you'd have gone to prison. All of us. Morrison, myself, the trainers who administered the injections. Pierce had documented everything, kept records that implicated everyone. We were all trapped. Lena leaned forward. What about the other players? The ones who survived the trials? Paid off, relocated, given new identities in some cases. Pierce had enough money to make problems disappear, but some of them, Taggart trailed off. Some of them, what? Started having health problems years later. Memory loss, personality changes, early onset dementia. We all knew it was connected to the drugs, but there was nothing we could do. Admitting the truth would have destroyed what was left of our lives. As the interview concluded, Taggart handed Detective Ruiz a key. Storage unit across town. Everything I kept from those years. Medical records, financial documents, communications with Pierce. I'm too old to run anymore. Too tired to keep lying. Outside Taggart's house, Lena and Detective Ruiz sat in the police cruiser, processing what they'd learned. The conspiracy was even larger than they'd imagined, involving not just murder, but systematic fraud, corruption, and the destruction of young men's lives. How many others knew? Lena asked. University administration, medical staff, probably some athletic department officials. Could be dozens of people who kept this secret for 25 years. Lena's phone buzzed with another unknown number. This time, the voice wasn't electronically disguised. Miss Ortiz, this is Randall Pierce. I think it's time we had a conversation. The meeting with Randall Pierce took place at his estate on the outskirts of Iron Ridge, a sprawling colonial that overlooked the Tuscarawas River Valley. Pierce had insisted on meeting alone, but Detective Ruiz refused to allow Lena to go without backup. They compromised on a wire and surveillance team positioned outside the property. Pierce met them at the front door himself. No lawyers or security in sight. At 68, he remained an imposing figure. Tall, silver-haired, with the kind of commanding presence that had built a business empire from a single construction company. Miss Ortiz, Detective Ruiz, thank you for coming. His tone was cordial, almost grandfatherly. Please, let's talk in my study. The study was exactly what Lena had expected. Leather-bound books, hunting trophies, photographs of Pierce with politicians and business leaders spanning 4 decades. What she hadn't expected was the manila folder waiting on his desk, thick with documents. I assume you've spoken with Coach Taggart, Pierce said, settling behind his desk. Poor Ray. Never could handle the pressure. Mr. Pierce, Detective Ruiz began. You're under no obligation to speak without an attorney present. Pierce waved dismissively. At my age, Detective, lawyers are just an expensive way to postpone the inevitable. Besides, I have a story to tell, and I'd prefer Miss Ortiz hear it from me rather than piece it together from Ray's selective memory. He opened the manila folder and spread documents across the desk. Financial records, medical reports, correspondence between university officials, a comprehensive archive of the conspiracy that had cost Derek Benton his life. The drug trials were my idea, Pierce said without preamble. Military research had shown promising results for performance enhancement, and I saw an opportunity to adapt the technology for civilian applications. The potential market was enormous. College athletics, professional sports, even corporate training programs. Lena kept her expression neutral, though Pierce's casual admission of guilt was stunning. You knew the risks? I knew there were risks. All pharmaceutical research involves risks, but the military data suggested the compounds were safe within established dosage parameters. Pierce pulled out a thick report, bound in military green covers. Project Apex, 1982 to 1983. The Army had tested PX-19 on volunteer soldiers for 6 months with minimal adverse effects. What we didn't know was that the military had been using much lower doses than recommended by the pharmaceutical company. So you used the higher doses, Detective Ruiz said. We used the doses that showed maximum effectiveness in laboratory settings. Unfortunately, what worked in controlled lab conditions proved problematic in real-world applications. Pierce's clinical detachment was chilling. He spoke about Derek's death and the other casualties as if discussing quarterly profit reports rather than human lives. When did you realize the trials were killing people? Lena asked. Derek's death was the first clear indication that our dosage protocols were flawed, but by then, we'd invested too much to simply shut down the program. Pierce stood and walked to the window, overlooking his property. You have to understand the broader context. Iron Ridge was dying in 1984. The steel mill was closing. Unemployment was approaching 30%. Young people were leaving for opportunities elsewhere. The football program was one of the few things keeping the community together. "So you covered up murder to save a football team?" Pierce turned back to them, his expression hardening. "I made difficult decisions to protect hundreds of jobs, millions of dollars in economic activity, and the future of an entire community. Derek Benton's death was a tragedy, but allowing that tragedy to destroy everything else would have been criminally irresponsible." The rationalization was breathtaking in its scope. Pierce had convinced himself that covering up drug trials and murder was actually a form of public service. "Tell us about the other players," Detective Ruiz demanded. Pierce returned to his desk and pulled out a different folder. 12 players participated in the trials over 2 academic years. 3 died as a direct result of the medication: Derek, Jimmy Chen, and Marcus Williams. The others experienced various side effects, most of which resolved after we discontinued their participation. Resolved? Lena couldn't keep the skepticism out of her voice. 4 players showed no long-term effects and went on to successful careers. 2 developed chronic neurological conditions requiring ongoing medical care, which my foundation has provided discreetly for 25 years. 3 others experienced psychological effects: depression, anxiety, personality changes, and received similar support. Pierce opened another file, revealing financial records showing regular payments to individuals across the country. "I've spent approximately $12 million over the past quarter-century, providing medical care, financial support, and other assistance to the surviving participants and their families." The revelation hit Lena like a physical blow. Pierce hadn't just covered up the drug trials. He'd been managing the aftermath for decades, essentially buying the silence of everyone involved. "Where are they now?" Detective Ruiz asked. "Scattered across the country, living under new identities in some cases. I can provide contact information, though I suspect most will be reluctant to speak publicly." Pierce handed them a list of names and addresses. Lena recognized some from Derek's ledger, but others were completely new. "What about the university officials who knew?" she asked. "President Morrison died in 1995. Dean Phillips retired to Florida and passed away 3 years ago. Most of the medical staff have either died or moved out of state. The cover-up was remarkably successful because so few people knew the complete truth." Detective Ruiz leaned forward. "Why are you telling us this now? You could have maintained the cover-up indefinitely." Pierce's smile was sad and tired. "Because I'm dying, Detective. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. My doctors give me 3 months, maybe 6 if I'm lucky. And because that storage unit was always going to surface eventually." C.J. Jennings was never as clever as he thought. The admission explained Pierce's sudden willingness to cooperate. With death approaching, the elaborate web of lies and bribes that had protected him for 25 years no longer mattered. "I have one condition for my full cooperation," Pierce continued. "I want to speak with Derek's brother personally, to explain what really happened and why we made the choices we did." "That's not your decision to make," Detective Ruiz said. "No, but it's Trevor's decision whether to accept my apology or not." Pierce pulled out one final document, a handwritten letter on personal stationery. "I wrote this 25 years ago, but never had the courage to send it. Perhaps it's time." Lena read the letter, her hands trembling slightly. It was a full confession, detailing Pierce's role in the drug trials, Derek's death, and the subsequent cover-up. But it was also something else, a desperate attempt at justification from a man who'd spent decades convincing himself that his actions had served a greater good. "There's something else you need to know," Pierce said as they prepared to leave. "Something that will change how you understand this entire story." He walked to a wall safe hidden behind a painting and removed a thick envelope. Derek Benton didn't die from a seizure caused by PX-19. The statement hung in the air like a thunderclap. Lena felt her understanding of the case shift and realign. "What do you mean?" Pierce opened the envelope and pulled out what appeared to be medical records. "The autopsy report we suppressed shows that Derek died from blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with being struck by a heavy object. The seizure story was fabricated to hide the real cause of death. Detective Ruiz grabbed the medical documents. "Who killed him?" "That," Pierce said quietly, "is the question I've been trying to answer for 25 years. Because whoever murdered Derek Benton, it wasn't the drugs. And it wasn't anyone involved in the cover-up." The revelation shattered everything they thought they knew about the case. Derek Benton hadn't died from experimental drugs. He'd been murdered by someone else entirely. The drug trials, the cover-up, the conspiracy involving university officials and wealthy boosters. All of it had been used to hide a completely different crime. "Who else knew Derek was planning to expose the trials?" Lena asked. Pierce consulted his notes. "Coach Taggart, Dr. Morrison, myself, and whoever Derek confided in about his plans. But the killer would have needed access to the locker room that night, knowledge of Derek's schedule, and a reason to want him dead that had nothing to do with the drug trials." As they left Pierce's estate, Lena's mind raced through the implications. Someone had used the drug trial scandal as cover for murder, allowing the real killer to remain hidden for 25 years, while everyone focused on the pharmaceutical conspiracy. The question now was simple but terrifying. If Randall Pierce hadn't killed Derek Benton, who had? The revelation that Derek Benton had been murdered rather than killed by experimental drugs sent shockwaves through the investigation. Detective Ruiz immediately ordered the crime scene team to re-examine Derek's remains, looking for evidence of blunt force trauma that had been missed in the initial discovery. Lena spent the night at her parents' house, unable to sleep as she reconstructed the timeline of March 15th, 1984. If Derek hadn't died from a seizure, then someone had deliberately killed him and used the drug trial cover-up to hide the crime. The question was, who had both the motive and opportunity? Her phone rang at 6 a.m. Trevor Benton's voice was tight with controlled emotion. "Lena, you need to see something. I found more of Derek's things in the attic. Stuff I missed before." She met Trevor at the family home, where he'd spread dozens of photographs across the kitchen table. Most were typical college pictures. Derek with teammates, at parties, studying in the library. But one photo stood out. A Polaroid showing Derek wearing his red and white Letterman jacket. Timestamp reading 10 p.m., March 15th, 84. "This was taken the night he died," Trevor said. "But look at the background." Lena studied the photo more carefully. Derek was standing outside what appeared to be an apartment building, talking to someone whose face was partially obscured by shadow. The timestamp proved he'd been wearing the jacket much later than the official story claimed. "Do you recognize the building?" she asked. Trevor nodded grimly. "University housing for graduate students and teaching assistants. Derek had no reason to be there unless he was meeting someone." They drove to the university campus, where the graduate housing complex still stood, largely unchanged after 25 years. The building superintendent, a maintenance worker named Eddie Kowalski, who'd been on the job since the 1970s, remembered the night Derek disappeared. "Police came around asking questions the next week," Kowalski said, unlocking the building's front door. "But they were asking about whether Derek had been seen leaving campus, not whether he'd been here. Do you remember seeing him that night?" "Sure do. Around 10:15, maybe 10:30. Was talking to one of the grad students outside the building. Seemed like a serious conversation. Lot of hand-waving, raised voices." Lena felt her pulse quicken. "Do you remember which grad student?" Kowalski thought for a moment. "Pretty sure it was that Morrison kid. David Morrison, maybe. Son of the doctor who worked with the football team." The name hit like a lightning bolt. Dr. Morrison's son had been a graduate student in 1984, which meant he would have known about the drug trials and his father's involvement. But what connection did he have to Derek? Detective Ruiz met them at the police station, where she'd been coordinating with the coroner's office about re-examining Derek's remains. The news wasn't good. After 25 years underground, there's not much forensic evidence left, she reported. But the skull does show signs of blunt force trauma, consistent with being struck by a cylindrical object, maybe a baseball bat or similar weapon. What about the location where he was found? Crime scene team is going back through the tunnel today, looking for anything we might have missed. But after a quarter century, plus the concrete ceiling and recent construction work, the chances of finding additional evidence are slim. Lena shared what they'd learned about David Morrison and the graduate housing complex. Ruiz immediately began pulling records, trying to track down Morrison's current whereabouts. David Morrison graduated 1985 with a master's degree in sports psychology, she read from university records. Last known address was Columbus, Ohio, but that was 15 years ago. Sports psychology, Trevor mused. He would have been studying the mental aspects of athletic performance. The pieces were starting to fit together. David Morrison would have had inside knowledge of the drug trials through his father, access to university facilities, and professional interest in the psychological effects of performance enhancement. But what was his motive for killing Derek? The answer came from an unexpected source. Rebecca Chen called Lena that afternoon with information she'd uncovered while researching her brother Jimmy's death. "I found Jimmy's journal from 1984, she said. "He mentions Derek several times, but also someone named Dave Morrison. Says Dave was asking a lot of questions about the side effects players were experiencing." "What kind of questions?" "Personal stuff. How the drugs made them feel, whether they were having mood swings or aggressive thoughts, if they'd considered hurting themselves or others." Jimmy thought Dave was writing his thesis about performance drugs and psychology. The implication was chilling. If David Morrison had been studying the psychological effects of PX19, he would have known about the dangerous side effects before anyone else. He might even have been the one who recommended higher dosages to maximize the psychological impact. Detective Ruiz located David Morrison through Social Security records. He was living in Denver, working as a sports psychologist for a professional baseball team. More importantly, he was scheduled to return to Iron Ridge the following week for his father's funeral. Dr. Morrison had died 3 days earlier from complications related to diabetes. "We could arrest him in Denver," Ruiz said. "But I'd rather wait until he comes here. He'll be more likely to make mistakes on familiar ground." Lena spent the evening researching David Morrison's career, looking for patterns that might explain his motive for murder. What she found was troubling. Morrison had built his reputation on groundbreaking research into the psychological effects of performance-enhancing drugs, work that had earned him a prominent position in professional sports. The timing was suspicious. Morrison's first published paper on the topic appeared in 1985, less than a year after Derek's death. His subsequent research had made him a recognized expert in the field, leading to lucrative consulting contracts and speaking engagements. He built his career on Derek's death, Lena realized, calling Trevor with her discovery. The psychological data he gathered from the drug trials, maybe even from Derek specifically, became the foundation for everything he accomplished afterward. Trevor was quiet for a long moment. "You think he killed Derek to protect his research? Or to ensure he was the only one who had access to the data? If Derek exposed the drug trials, Morrison would have lost his exclusive access to information that was worth millions in consulting fees." The theory gained support when Lena discovered that Morrison had published extensively about the psychological profiles of athletes who'd participated in performance enhancement programs. His research described subjects who exhibited exactly the symptoms Derek and Jimmy had experienced: seizures, mood swings, paranoia, aggressive behavior. But Morrison's research went further, documenting the progression of symptoms in ways that suggested he'd observed subjects until their deaths. The clinical detachment in his writing was chilling, describing human subjects as if they were laboratory animals rather than young men with families and futures. Detective Ruiz called the next morning with disturbing news. "I contacted Denver PD to verify Morrison's whereabouts. He took a leave of absence from his job 3 weeks ago, claiming he needed time to handle his father's affairs. But neighbors say he hasn't been seen at his apartment in over a month." "You think he's already here?" "I think he's been here since his father got sick. Maybe longer." The realization that Morrison might already be in Iron Ridge sent a chill through Lena. If he'd been monitoring the investigation, he would know about CJ's confession, the discovery of Derek's remains, and the unraveling of the cover-up story. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, Meet me at the old stadium tunnel. Come alone. Time to finish what we started 25 years ago." Lena stared at the message, her hands trembling. Morrison was making his move. But why contact her directly instead of trying to disappear? She called Detective Ruiz immediately. "He wants to meet at the stadium. The tunnel where we found Derek." "Absolutely not. This is obviously a trap." "Maybe. But it's also our chance to get him to confess. He's been carrying this secret for 25 years. He might be ready to talk." Ruiz was quiet for a moment, considering options. "If we do this, you wear a wire, and we have tactical teams positioned around the entire area. At the first sign of trouble, we move in." An hour later, Lena walked across the Iron Ridge High School football field toward the construction site where Derek's body had been discovered. The setting sun cast long shadows across the field, and the abandoned construction equipment looked like prehistoric beasts in the fading light. The tunnel entrance had been cleared by the crime scene team, leaving a gaping hole in the earth that descended into darkness. Portable floodlights illuminated the opening, but beyond their reach, the tunnel disappeared into black uncertainty. A figure emerged from the shadows near the maintenance building. David Morrison looked older than his 57 years, his hair completely gray, and his face bearing the lines of someone who'd carried a heavy burden for decades. "Miss Ortiz," he said, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to academic lectures. "Thank you for coming, Dr. Morrison. You wanted to talk?" He smiled sadly. "I wanted to explain. After 25 years, someone should know the truth about what really happened that night." Morrison gestured toward the tunnel entrance. "It all started down there, you know. Not with Derek's death, but with the research that made his death necessary." Lena kept her distance, acutely aware of the wire she wore and the tactical teams positioned around the stadium. "Tell me about the research." "Revolutionary work. I was documenting the psychological effects of performance enhancement in real time, observing subjects as they experienced the full range of neurochemical changes. It was the kind of data that could reshape our understanding of human psychology under extreme stress." "You were experimenting on Derek and the other players." Morrison's expression hardened. "I was conducting legitimate research with willing participants. The fact that my father and Pierce were also using them for their own purposes was convenient. Derek wasn't willing at the end. He was going to expose everything. Derek was going to destroy years of groundbreaking research because he couldn't handle a few side effects. Do you have any idea what that data was worth? What it could have meant for the future of sports psychology?" Morrison stepped closer, and Lena could see the obsession burning in his eyes. After 25 years, he was still convinced that his research justified Derek's murder. "So you killed him," she said. "I preserved the integrity of the study," Morrison corrected. "Derek's death provided the final data point I needed to complete my research on the ultimate psychological effects of performance enhancement." The admission hung in the air between them as sirens began wailing in the distance. Morrison's confession hung in the air as police sirens grew louder, but he seemed oblivious to the approaching tactical teams. His attention remained fixed on Lena, his eyes holding the fervor of someone who'd spent 25 years waiting to justify his actions. "You don't understand," he said, stepping closer. "Derek's death wasn't murder. It was the completion of the most important psychological study ever conducted. The data I gathered from his final moments revolutionized our understanding of human performance under extreme stress." Lena fought to keep her voice steady. "You killed a 22-year-old man for research data. I preserved groundbreaking scientific work that would have been lost forever if Derek had exposed the trials. Do you know what happened to my subjects after Derek died? My father panicked. Pierce shut down the program, and years of irreplaceable data nearly disappeared." Morrison reached into his jacket pocket and Lena tensed, ready to run. But he pulled out a worn notebook rather than a weapon. This contained psychological profiles of every subject, documented behavioral changes, detailed analysis of neurochemical responses to PX-19. It's worth more than all of Pierce's construction contracts combined. "Worth more than Derek's life?" Morrison's expression darkened. Derek Benton was a test subject who forgot his place in the greater scientific endeavor. When he threatened to destroy everything, I had to make a choice between one person's life and research that could benefit thousands of future athletes. The sirens had stopped, meaning police units were in position around the stadium. Detective Ruiz's voice crackled through Lena's hidden earpiece. "Keep him talking. We're moving into position. Tell me what happened that night," Lena said. "The real story." Morrison opened his notebook, consulting pages filled with dense handwriting. "Derek came to see me around 10 p.m., said he'd decided to expose the drug trials regardless of the consequences. He showed me a letter he'd written to the NCAA, complete with documentation and names. So you convinced him to meet you at the stadium. I told him I had additional evidence that would strengthen his case. Medical records from my father's files that proved the university administration knew about the dangerous side effects. Derek was eager to see them. Morrison's clinical detachment was chilling. He described manipulating Derek's desire for justice as if discussing a successful experiment rather than premeditated murder. We met at the locker room around 11:15. I brought him to the equipment area, showed him boxes of what I claimed were medical files. While he was examining them, I struck him with a baseball bat. The matter-of-fact confession made Lena's stomach turn. "You planned to kill him from the beginning." "I planned to preserve the integrity of my research. Derek's death was a necessary component of the study. I needed to document the ultimate psychological response to performance enhancement stress." Morrison flipped to another page in his notebook. Even as he was dying, Derek provided valuable data. His final words, the fear response, the way the PX-19 in his system interacted with massive trauma. All of it contributed to my understanding of human psychology under extreme duress. "You're insane." "I'm a scientist," Morrison corrected. "And my work has been vindicated by 25 years of success in professional sports psychology. Teams across the country use techniques I developed based on data gathered from Derek and the other subjects." Through her earpiece, Lena heard Detective Ruiz coordinating the final approach. Tactical teams were surrounding the stadium, but they needed Morrison to remain in the open long enough for a safe arrest. "What about Jimmy Chen?" she asked. "Did you kill him too?" Morrison shook his head. Jimmy's death was genuinely accidental. Though scientifically useful, the delayed neurological effects I observed in him provided crucial data about long-term PX-19 exposure. His car accident was simply the final data point in his psychological profile. The casual dismissal of Jimmy's death as a data point revealed the depth of Morrison's sociopathy. He'd spent decades treating human beings as laboratory specimens, convincing himself that scientific advancement justified any atrocity. "Why contact me now?" Lena asked. "You could have disappeared when your father died." Morrison's smile was sad and distant. "Because the study is finally complete. My father's death provided the last piece of data I needed. The psychological profile of a co-conspirator living with 25 years of guilt and medical consequences." He held up his notebook like a trophy. Dr. Morrison died knowing his participation in the cover-up had destroyed his career and his family. The stress-related diabetes that killed him was directly connected to the psychological burden of his secrets. Even that was scientifically valuable. Lena realized with growing horror that Morrison had been conducting psychological experiments on everyone involved in the cover-up, treating their guilt and fear as research data rather than human suffering. "You've been studying all of us, haven't you? Pierce, Coach Taggart, CJ Jennings, everyone connected to Derek's death. 25 years of longitudinal data on the psychological effects of maintaining a conspiracy. Pierce's cancer, Taggart's alcoholism, CJ's decision to finally confess. All of it documented and analyzed. The stress of keeping Derek's secret literally destroyed their lives, and I recorded every moment." Morrison opened to the notebook's final pages. "And now you, Miss Ortiz, a young journalist whose investigation has triggered the final collapse of the conspiracy. Your psychological profile will complete the study, the external catalyst who forces truth into light despite systemic resistance." The realization hit Lena like ice water. Morrison hadn't contacted her to confess. He'd lured her here to complete his sick experiment. She was the final test subject in a study that had consumed Derek Benton and everyone connected to his death. "What do you want from me?" Morrison pulled a syringe from his jacket pocket, its needle glinting in the floodlight. "The same thing I wanted from Derek. Your contribution to groundbreaking psychological research. That's PX-19, the original compound, preserved from my father's laboratory. I've been saving it for 25 years, waiting for the right subject to complete the study. A journalist investigating Derek's death, experiencing the same stress and determination that killed him, provides the perfect symmetry." Morrison stepped closer, holding the syringe like a weapon. "Don't worry, Miss Ortiz. Your death will serve a greater purpose. The psychological data I gather from your final moments will help me understand the complete cycle of investigation, discovery, and consequence." Through her earpiece, Lena heard Detective Ruiz giving orders. "All units move in. Subject is armed and threatening the target." But Morrison was too close, and the syringe was already moving toward her arm. Lena grabbed a piece of construction debris, a length of rebar, and swung it at Morrison's hand. The syringe flew through the air, shattering against the tunnel entrance. Morrison lunged at her, his clinical detachment replaced by desperate fury. "You don't understand! 25 years of research! You're destroying everything!" They struggled near the edge of the tunnel opening, Morrison's hands reaching for her throat. Lena brought the rebar up between them, using it to keep him at distance, while screaming for help. "Derek trusted you," she gasped. "He came to you for help, and you murdered him." "Derek was weak," Morrison snarled. He couldn't handle the psychological pressure of being a test subject. But his weakness provided valuable data about performance enhancement failure. Tactical officers appeared at the tunnel entrance, weapons drawn. But Morrison and Lena were too close to the edge for them to risk a shot. Detective Ruiz was shouting commands, trying to coordinate a safe rescue. Morrison made one final desperate grab for the fallen syringe, overbalancing himself near the tunnel opening. Lena pushed away from him with all her strength, sending him stumbling backward toward the excavated hole. For a moment, Morrison teetered on the edge, his notebook clutched against his chest like a shield. Then gravity took hold, and he fell into the darkness where Derek Benton's body had lain hidden for 25 years. The fall wasn't far, maybe 8 feet, but Morrison hit the concrete floor of the tunnel with a sickening crack. When tactical officers rappelled down to check on him, they found him unconscious, his notebook scattered around him, pages of psychological observations and clinical notes, mixing with the dirt where Derek had died. Detective Ruiz helped Lena to her feet, her hands shaking with adrenaline and relief. "Are you hurt?" "No," Lena managed, "but he confessed to everything. Derek's murder, the cover-up, 25 years of psychological experimentation on everyone involved. We got it all on tape," Ruiz confirmed. Morrison's going away for the rest of his life. As paramedics worked to stabilize Morrison and extract him from the tunnel, Lena looked across the football field toward the lights of Iron Ridge. The town had built its identity around Friday night football and the mythology of young heroes, never knowing that its greatest legend had been murdered by someone who saw human lives as nothing more than research data. The investigation that had begun with a blood-stained Letterman jacket in a storage unit was finally over. Derek Benton could rest in peace, his killer brought to justice, his family's 25-year search for truth complete. But Lena knew the real work was just beginning. Morrison's notebook contained evidence of crimes that stretched far beyond Derek's murder, revealing a pattern of psychological manipulation and exploitation that might have affected dozens of people over the decades. Justice for Derek Benton was only the first step in uncovering the full scope of Dr. David Morrison's monstrous career. 6 months after David Morrison's arrest, Lena Ortiz stood in the Iron Ridge High School gymnasium, watching Derek Benton's jersey being retired in a ceremony that finally told the truth about the town's fallen hero. The red and white number 12 now hung beside other honored players. But this time, the accompanying plaque told the real story. Not of a young man who ran away from pressure, but of someone who died trying to protect his teammates from dangerous exploitation. Trevor Benton spoke at the ceremony, his voice steady despite 25 years of waiting for this moment. My brother Derek didn't disappear because he was afraid of the NFL draft. He died because he was brave enough to stand up against people who were treating college athletes like laboratory animals. The gymnasium was packed with former players, community members, and journalists from across the state. Lena's investigation had grown into a national story about corruption in college athletics, leading to congressional hearings and NCAA reforms aimed at protecting student athletes from exploitation. Morrison had been sentenced to life in prison for Derek's murder, plus additional charges related to his decades-long psychological experimentation on the conspiracy's survivors. His notebook had revealed the full scope of his crimes, not just observing the effects of guilt and trauma on those involved in the cover-up, but actively manipulating their psychological states to gather research data. Coach Taggart had testified against Morrison in exchange for a reduced sentence on conspiracy charges. At 72, he'd been sentenced to 5 years in minimum security prison, though his lawyer expected he'd serve less than 2 years due to his cooperation and advanced age. Randall Pierce had died 3 weeks before Morrison's trial began, his cancer claiming him just as the full scope of the conspiracy became public. His estate was facing dozens of civil lawsuits from the families of players who'd participated in the drug trials, but Pierce's death meant the criminal charges against him would never be resolved. The surviving participants in the PX-19 trials had been located across the country, many suffering from long-term neurological effects that were finally being properly treated with medical care funded by Pierce's estate. 2 players had died from conditions likely related to their participation in the experiments, bringing the total death toll to 5 young men whose lives were cut short by performance-enhancing drugs that should never have been tested on humans. Lena had spent the month since Morrison's arrest writing a book about the investigation, tentatively titled The Price of Glory: How America's Obsession with Winning Killed Derek Benton. Publishers were interested, but Lena was still deciding whether she wanted to profit from a story that had cost so many people their lives. Detective Ruiz had been promoted to lead the newly created cold case unit for Stark County, with Derek's case serving as a model for how persistent investigation could solve decades-old mysteries. The success had brought her national recognition and job offers from bigger departments, but she'd chosen to stay in Ohio, believing that small communities deserved the same quality of police work as major cities. After the ceremony, Lena walked across the parking lot where Derek's car had been found 25 years earlier, staged to look like he'd abandoned it before running away. The lie had persisted for a quarter century, but the truth had finally emerged through the patient work of people who refused to accept easy answers. Derek Benton's story was over, but his legacy would be the reforms and protections put in place to ensure that future student athletes wouldn't be exploited by people who saw them as commodities rather than human beings with dreams, families, and futures worth protecting. Sometimes the biggest stories really did start with the smallest lies, and sometimes justice took 25 years to arrive. But in the end, the truth had won.